Welcome to Bellville Conversations, discussions about Bellville, the people, the place, and its future. Growing together the single and central node of Cape Town, bringing together different perspectives and moving forward in a collaborative and positive way through dialogue. Okay, welcome. And if you hadn't noticed already from the advertised flyer, I am not Warren Hewitt, the CEO of the Greater Tygerberg Partnership. Warren sends his apologies for not being here today. He has come into contact with somebody who is COVID positive and is currently self-isolating in a really strict and thoughtful way. So he is, in fact, joining us digitally and will be active in the chat bar, and he will be joining us from far. Okay, so by way of introduction, my name is Kirsten Wilkins. I'm the Managing Director of Open Streets Cape Town, with experience in both urban design and mobility justice, and I will be facilitating this session today on behalf of the Greater Tygerberg Partnership and in place of Warren today. Our intent for today's conversation is really not to be adversarial or to pick sides. Today we're going to be discussing the potential extension of the R300 and the impact that it's going to have on Bellville and surrounds. And it really is my pleasure to introduce to you in a few moments a wonderful group of speakers and panelists who will be sharing their perspectives and voices on this incredibly interesting topic which affects all of us living, working, and traveling through and around Bellville. So let me start by just letting you know who's on our panel, and then we're going to go to a series of introductory slides. So with us today, we have Deon van Zyl, the Chairperson of the Western Cape Property Development Forum. We have Justin Coetzee, the CEO of GoAscendal, and also the Chairman of the Greater Tygerberg Partnership Board. And we have Dr. Mercy Brown-Luthango, who is a senior researcher at the Africa Center for Cities. And we'll be hearing from them in a few moments. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you a quick introduction series of slides. For those in the audience who are not aware of the R300 extension or what that would look like spatially, we've put together a little bit of an orientation slide to kick us off. Unfortunately, a lot of the information around the development of the R300 and the details around that is not public knowledge. And so some of our panelists will touch on some of the statistics and the background of the project, but we're going to put up a slide now to just give you a sense of what we're talking about and spatially what the impact of that is. So if we can put up that intro slide, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks, Ryan. Okay. That's okay. It was there a second ago. All right. Okay, so while Ryan's pulling up the slide, I'll give you a little bit of a verbal. So the R300, there you go. The R300, as you can see on the slide there, currently has both a northern and a southern extension that are planned. For the most part today, we're going to be talking about the extension towards the north. And that really is from the N1 north through Durbanville to what is known as the Wellington Road Interchange or Wellington Road Exchange, with the idea that this R300 ring road would go all the way up to a Melkbosstrand N7, presumably to service and connect to the Atlantis development zone. And then the next slide, thanks, Ryan. And then the development of the R300 to the south, beyond the Jakes-Gerwel intersection in Philippi, would then go further south, as is the intent of the ring road, towards Muizenberg. Although, as you can see on the slide, it would be a pretty tricky decision to make with regards to the Philippi agricultural zone and the importance of the land in the deep south in terms of its ecological value. But we're not really going to focus on that today, though. We're going to focus on the R300 extension as it relates to impacting on Bellville and surrounds. So you can go to the next slide, thanks. All right, fantastic. So just by way of introduction, the R300 would in future, I think, be known as the N21, which is always great to have another road change name. But really, the idea of a ring road is to create more of a north-south link through the city. And as far as I can understand, this has been conceptualized since even before sort of 1995, 1996, when toll roads and road tolling were all the rage. And legislation came into effect to make that possible for companies and consortiums to bid for the extension of large-scale infrastructure in this way. So our discussion today is really going to go beyond the detailed design of the R300. And I think that's really where I want to step in and introduce our first panelist, who is Justin Coetzee. So Justin has a really good understanding of some of the more intricacies around the design and some of the details of what's been planned from a technocratic point of view. So I'm going to ask you, Justin, to jump in. Justin is currently the chair of the board at the Greater Tygerberg Partnership. His work in starting and as CEO of Go Metro really has been to drive transformative mobility solutions using data and technology, and looking at how it is that public transportation, not only in South Africa now, but globally, can be more innovative and really solve problems that we potentially don't even know that we have yet. So Justin, I'm going to hand the proverbial microphone over to you and ask you for some of your reflections on the extension of the R300 as it relates to Bellville. And I'm going to give you about 5 to 8 minutes to share your sort of initial thoughts with questions later. But just if you can set us off, I'd appreciate that. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have, as a city, a roadmap. It's called the Integrated Public Transport Network, and it's complemented by the Comprehensive Integrated Transport Plan. So that's a document that the City of Cape Town regularly updates. It's as the legislated local authority. It has the mandate under the National Land Transport Act to look after mobility and accessibility in and across the City of Cape Town. That includes automotive transport as well as public transport, walking, cycling, moving around. And so when we look at these plans that come from a long way back, we must understand that they come from a different time, a different world, a different normal. And certainly if you look at the last 30 years, we've appreciated a lot more the importance of place, the importance of densification, the importance of economic centers where we can bang ideas together. The vibrancy of Woodstock happens because you've got such an eclectic mix of artists and programmers and entrepreneurs and people that have been there for many, many generations. The fabric that we have in Bellville is really unique in the different generations that are intermixing the ideas. And so when we think of the city, both from a network point of view, which is where technocrats come from, they like to draw lines on a map and everything is solved by enough lines. But we also have human beings that live and exist in these places. And so over the last 30 years, we really have stopped trusting the master planner because we've seen where that leads us. We have the example of the US, we have the example of Australia, the UK, where they certainly are realizing that one person, one car is not the answer to the world and its problems. And in 1995, I think that was pretty much the predication, right? It was, well, we'll have automotive, the industry and the benefits of that. But now we've got climate change, we've got CO2 emissions, not just automotive and cars as emitters of CO2, but do you know that the biggest emissions industry is the cement industry? So when we say that we want to build a freeway of whatever length, it's not just the cars that will drive on it that will have an impact on our air quality, but the cement that goes into building that environment also has a huge toll in CO2 emissions. So 30 years on, we have a realization or an understanding of the interconnectedness of our systems. 30 years on, I think we also have an appreciation that perhaps the user pays principle is not necessarily politically accepted by the majority. When we talk about 1995 and the proposal being a toll road, nothing suggests that it would be different this time around. And certainly user pays and tolling would definitely be on the table. Now we dodged a bullet, I think, a while ago with regards to the N1, N2 toll plan and the city's resistance to such because of the impact on the next road network. And certainly a scheme like this also would raise questions around who pays for it and what are they paying for? So from an affordability point of view, it's a serious question. Then we also look at it in terms of equity and the city's budget. The city's budget only goes so far. So whenever we are building any infrastructure, there's a life cycle cost to that infrastructure's existence. There's, for a freeway, there's maintenance, there's regular resurfacing. For the developments that go along that freeway, we got to get pipes of water to them. We've got to get pipes of sewage, hopefully, away from them. We've got to get power lines to them. So there's an enormous cost on the city's budget to provide services everywhere that it needs to, that it has a constitutional obligation to do so. When we look at the ITP, the comprehensive ITP, I think this project, the R300 Northern Extension, was ranked as number 33 in terms of priority and impact. And so there's many other ways where we can improve the network across Cape Town before we look at such an extension. When we zoom in at Bellville and we think about what we're trying to achieve in the urban form and the urban regeneration around Cape Town, the example of Cape Town CBD, the example of the Foot Road Corridor, yes, gentrification does have its negative consequences, and we're learning about that as we go along and developing strategies to mitigate such. But I think the opportunity to really establish Bellville as the gateway to the rest of the Western Cape. From Bellville, you can go north, you can go east, you can go west, you can go south. Bellville as an interchange historically, whether it was an ox wagon, whether it's today a taxi, Bellville is the interchange. It's where we mingle as Cape Townians. It's where we swap over. In fact, my love for transport was born on a platform in Bellville. When I would hear, women not being able to pick up their kids from school because the trains were late, people losing their jobs because trains were late. Rail is another story and another conversation for another day. But the point is that I have a personal connection to a platform in Bellville because my entire entrepreneurial journey started trying to solve that problem that I discovered by being a human being in Bellville. And so certainly I think we lose a lot if we start dispersing, and we lose a lot of value if we just start creating satellite developments. And so the biggest risk for a development like the R300 Northern Extension is that it almost acts like a centrifugal force pushing us outwards. Yes, the houses are cheaper on the fringe. So me and my family, we'll decide to move to the fringe. Now we move to the fringe, there's no buses. I used to take Golden Arrow regularly. I used to take taxis all the time. Now I've got to buy a car. And not just for me, but my wife, she doesn't work near me, so she's got to buy one too. And my kid, they're going to varsity next year. So I think, and suddenly we have 3 cars. And guess what? When you leave home, you expect to leave it somewhere for the day. So not only the impact on car ownership and motorization, which creates the cycle of investment, whether we want it or not, it happens. It also has an impact on the rest of Cape Town's parking requirements. Because my kid will pitch up at varsity and want a parking. My wife will pitch up at work and want a parking. I'll pitch up at work and want a parking. Post-pandemic, we imagine. And so when we look at this investment, we really must understand and play this out over 10, 15, 20, 25 years. This represents, you could say, an irreversible decision. I don't know of any freeways being ripped up anywhere around the world and being replaced by a green belt. So certainly when we look at this decision, it's not just one that we can take for our own convenience. Maybe I'm in traffic for an extra 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Maybe I would think that would solve a problem. Or maybe there's budget that we can now spend and create some economic stimulation. My argument would always be that this is a decision that we need to make for us and our children's sake. It's irreversible, largely irreversible. And so as we approach it and as we go about it, public participation, engagement, and really understanding the consequences of such a decision is important, because we're not living in the age of the master planner. We're living in the age of the democracy, the community, and the benefits need to translate to all. And so when we look at an investment like this and the impact on the Bellville CBD, our biggest concern, and as a board we've discussed this and we've considered this, our biggest concern is the centrifugal force that such a development exercises on pulling us apart, away from Bellville, because we'll each make individual economic decisions that make sense to us, but it doesn't make sense to society. and we'll then ask society to bear the cost for our personal decisions. So it's a very big door we're walking through. It's an irreversible decision. And I think it's very important that we don't say when it happens or when it comes. I think it's very important that we really identify that this is still a plan. And so the language should be if. If we as a society, as a community, as a city, decide to follow this objective, it should be under a rational basis and an agreed upon basis. So we definitely want to introduce today just a consideration in terms of language if the R300 North Extension happens, not when it happens.
Thanks. I really appreciate that if and when differentiation. I think we'll come back to that certainly in the questions a little bit later. And the naming of things is important too. I think what's clear to me in reading even the district SDF that's recently been out for comment now is that the R300 is spoken about as a sort of impenetrable mobility corridor. It's not, it has no value in its ability to connect except the beginning point and the end point. And beyond that, it actually does the opposite of connecting. And I think it's a very important thing for us to consider in light of the fact that large scale mobility infrastructure post-1994 has never really been built. And prior to that, it was always used in a very divisive, yet excessive, yet efficiency bringing manner. So I really appreciate your comments on that. And I think we're going to come back in the questions to well, if it isn't if, then what could it be? So we'll definitely touch on that in the question section. Thank you so much for that, Justin. Our next panelist is, I'm really happy to have you here, Dr. Mercy Brown-Luthango, and she's a doctor and senior researcher at the African Center for Cities, and also the convener of the newly launched master's program in sustainable urban practice, which goodness, if I wasn't so busy, I would absolutely sign up for it. It looks incredible. Her research focus is on the creation of sustainable human settlements, with a particular interest in the management of urban land and urban land markets. Her recent research, and where I came across her work in particular, includes a study of the Voortrekker Road Corridor Integration Zone and the social spatial transformation of the western areas, in particular of Maitland, Kensington, and Factorton. Mercy, it's really great to have you here today, and I'd really love for you to share with us some of the thoughts that you've had around this project, and even sort of platforming of what Justin has said now in terms of the potential of a major freeway expansion through Bellville, both to the north and the south, and the impact that would have spatially on the city of Cape Town. So the floor is yours for 5 to 8 minutes. Thanks, Mercy.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to GTP for the invitation. So I must admit, I don't know much about this project because, as you said, there's not much available in the public domain. So my input today is really because I have an interest in the Voortrekker Road Corridor Integration Zone, and particularly based on the research that we did in the western area, which is, as you mentioned, Maitland, Factorton, and Kensington. And I think Justin has already said, pointed out some of the things that I wanted to also just reflect on. But just to say that the aim of the research that we did in the western area of the VRC was really to understand how the formal development plans of the state, of private and public organizations, how that match up to the aspirations, the needs, the desires, the daily lived realities of people who live in these areas that are mostly affected by these big interventions, these big plans. And really, I just want to maybe just mention 2 or 3 points related to that. I think Justin already mentioned, the first is about unintended consequences and the limitation of public participation processes linked to these big scale development plans and infrastructure interventions. And often the voices of those who are most affected or potentially affected by these interventions are not included or considered. So just from looking at the Facebook posts and some of the things that have been written in the public domain, there's lots written already, and Justin has also mentioned the environmental impacts of this proposed R300 extension, both in terms of conservation efforts and the effects of urban sprawl on the environment. But I think even just the inclusion of some of the communities that might potentially be affected by this extension. I mean, it's been mentioned that the EIA process, for example, there was limited input and participation by communities that would be potentially affected by this. And it seems though that not enough has been done in terms of understanding the context, the livelihoods and social networks of poorer communities. And I suppose particularly in the case of the southern extension of this R300, who would be directly affected. These are some of the people who already spend more than 40% of their monthly income on transport costs, getting to and from work. And this is just the impact in terms of income, not to mention social impact, as well as the environmental impacts of unaffordable, inaccessible, and unsafe public transport systems. There was also a mention by Justin of the tolling fees, and we have to ask ourselves, what will this mean for poor people who already spend more than 40%? This will undoubtedly increase the transport costs of those who rely on public transport options like the minibus taxis and buses. And in my research, whether it was about looking at public housing interventions, or whether it's about the BRC or transport interventions, I find that, there's failure to engage people who would be most affected, like I said, and including them in a really fine-grained and in-depth analysis of what this would mean, what these development plans would mean for their daily lived realities before designing and even implementing these projects. And this often results in unintended consequences which impose an already additional burden on already stretched households. And this only perpetuates the current cycle of poverty, inequality, exclusion, violence, and deprivations, which poor families in the city face on a daily basis. Secondly, as part of our research at the Voortrekker Road Corridor, the Western area, we conducted spot interviews with commuters coming through Maitland Station and Mutual Station. And I must say this was not an extensive quantitative survey, but the insights we gained were quite interesting. So we asked people where they came from, we asked them what their purpose was for traveling through the VRC, and whether they would like to stay if in some of these areas, and also what their preferred mode of transport was. And so we found that people hail from a wide range of areas, including Athlone, Molnerton, Philippi Langa, Brackenfell College, and I think it just makes the point that people come from all over, that these places are really places of connection for people coming from all over the city, even as far afield as the Strand. And people's predominant reason for traveling was to find employment and also to find connection to other parts of the city. And their preferred mode of transport was the train. And interestingly, many of the people that we asked said they wouldn't prefer necessarily to stay in these areas because of the social networks they already have in the places where they live. And so a similar exercise was done by a group of students from the New York school, the new school in New York, that we hosted at Bellville Station, actually. And they interviewed 48 commuters, like I said, not a huge sample or anything, but again, they found that 73% of the people, the 48 people they spoke to, also come from a wide range of areas. And they also said they wouldn't necessarily like to live in Bellville, but their recommendation was that investment could be better targeted at first upgrading the transportation system that already exists by improving the frequency of trains, general safety standards at train stations, and interconnectivity between different types of public transport systems. So this also then concurs with the city's baseline assessment of the 4-sector road corridor integration zone, which highlighted the improvement of poor rail services and station precincts and expanding limited feeder services, which, as we know, contribute to high levels of cost and travel times for poor commuters. So lastly, just given the Yeah, this is my last point. So just, given the history of spatial and transport planning in this country and in the city, and the fact that Cape Town, like many other metros in South Africa, is still battling to undo the legacy of apartheid spatial planning and to deal with this fragmentation and environmentally and socially unsustainable planning patterns. And the cost which they impose on poor families. We have to ask really, if this thing happens, who are the main beneficiaries of this development? And whether it will advance the quest for sustainable urban mobility and transport equity in the city. Sustainable urban mobility requires an integrated, environmentally well-functioning transport system, that is convenient, that is safe, that is affordable for everyone. And it demands a fairer, more equitable distribution of the costs and benefits of these interventions. So I'm not an economist, but just in conclusion, I would say that we need a thorough cost-benefit analysis before any of this is done. And this should not just be focused on economic cost or economic efficiency and all these, which are the usual arguments, but also look at the social cost and benefits, environmental costs and benefits. And finally, who will benefit and who are the inevitable losers of such an intervention. And how these benefits and costs will be distributed. So, that's
fantastic. Yeah, at Open Street, we always ask the question, who stands to win and who stands to lose if we fail? And how do you know how to answer those two questions? So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really insightful. I think to sort of preempt a question that I have later, I'm going to ask you while Deon's sharing his reflections with us, I want us to, maybe even as an audience, think you can also pop some questions into the chat bar, the Q&A bar as you go, if you haven't done so already. If our communities are changing as these master plans sort of sit and gather dust or gather momentum, depending on your perspective. But the value of the land is changing too, not only ecologically, but also how communities have taken to road reserves and space set aside for master planning. And so we're going to come back and chat a little bit more about the value of the land that has been set aside and is currently waiting for a solution. Okay, so Deon, thanks for your patience in waiting as we come to you. I was initially going to have you as my first speaker, so you're as patient as the R300 extension. We didn't know when it was happening, but now it's your turn. So Deon, you're fantastic. Deon's the chairperson currently of the Western Cape Property Development Forum, and you have been for quite some time now. And by profession is an urban designer and working in project management and development facilitation. He's also the CEO of Alvain Loepscher and Associates with experience in large-scale development facilitation. Many of the projects with Heartland out in Somerset West, which is where I think we first met, actually. And so, Deon, I'd love for you, with your perspective and your huge experience in understanding how developments like this would roll out with and alongside major infrastructure, if you can share with us what your reflections are on the impact of this R300 extension on not only on property, but just in terms of your experience on where the opportunities and risks may lie. So, Deon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten, and also to Mercy and Justin, and of course the GTP for hosting this discussion. I feel a little bit like a Philistine because I grew up being taught that bulk infrastructural projects are bad and, it does all of these ecological things that you talk to. And then I had to learn some hard lessons, and that is, if one is to see change, it also means that you've got to make some brutal, tough decisions sometimes. And I think the danger that we have in this debate is we shouldn't skew the debate. I mean, the social and the urban fabric and the fine-grained character of certain areas is non-negotiable. I don't think that should be up for debate. My question is more starting at a metropolitan scale. What is Cape Town going to look like in 2050? And I look at the spatial development frameworks and I get no answer. And I look at the city's IDP and I actually get no answer because nobody dares to have a vision, right? So my point of departure here, before we drop down into the finer scale, is what has Cape Town got to be like? What has it got to be in 2050 to firstly be a sustainable, successful city? And what does that require? The second thing is, what is it going to have to be to attract investment? Because it's an illusion that our current economy in Cape Town can just sustain itself. You look at the levels of unemployment, you look at the growth of unemployment, you look at the youth unemployment, and then I realized that we need some serious intervention. We need to literally pump some adrenaline into the economy, which unfortunately will require some tough decisions, and some of it will have long-term impacts. So before one debates whether this is the right intervention or not, the question really for me is, what must Cape Town be to sustain and be and survive by 2050 or later? The second question is, okay, so if we've got to make some tough interventions, what can attract investment? And again, I've got to just put this in context of, I'm not debating at this stage, and I will get to it, the role of finer grain and heritage and all of these wonderful things. But I ask myself, what will make Cape Town attractive to external investment? Now, as Kirsten said, I spent quite a number of years out in Somerset West, and I always ask myself the question, why do we discriminating against the economy in the Southern Cape with the Somerset West bottleneck? It takes the economy to come into Cape Town from the Southern Cape to go through the Solaris Pass area, through the bottlenecks, etc., and vice versa. And then I realized, but hold on, the N1 and the N2 no longer comes together at the R300 or even Cape Town CBD. It actually comes together in Worcester because the economy bypasses the Helderberg and travels from Swellendam to Worcester and vice versa because of the bottlenecks. So that penny dropped with me. And then I started to go into a little bit of a finer grain debate, and I asked myself, well, what are the bottlenecks in the metropolitan area? And again, I'm talking about economic bottlenecks. I'm not necessarily talking about private car movement or commercial vehicle. I'm talking about economic bottlenecks. And then I realized that until the R300 upgrade took place, when was it, 2003, 2004-ish, between the N1 and the N2, those living to the south of the N2 and those living to the north of the N1 were actually very successfully segregated at economic level, at a physical level. And if you wanted to get to Cape Town, you still travel to Cape Town, over to the northern suburbs from the Cape Flats, still go via the CBD of Cape Town, and you make the Wishbone return trip and vice versa. But what I then started to look at is investment and how there has been an incredible growth in investment south of the N2. Places like Mitchell's Plain and the investment that has taken place there. And the question that I posed myself is, was it just magically, or was it because anonymity had broken down? Money could enter safely into an area and exit safely, quickly, efficiently, and vice versa. And then I started to look at people movements, and I've looked at the investment on the R300 and the freight industry now refers to the Golden Triangle, the N1, the N2, and the R300. And it's actually making a major reshaping of the metropolitan area. Good, bad, discuss that. But the point is change has taken place. I also looked at the intervention on the, what is it, the R2021 between OR Tambo and Pretoria, and the level of investment taken place there, and the job creation. And I cannot but come to the conclusion that large interventions have large economic responses. So when you're in a time of crisis, as we are in Cape Town right now, we don't have a vision, we don't know what Cape Town is going to look like in 2050. Our youth unemployment is growing.
Oh, hello.
The latest unemployment numbers show that we are not that different to the rest of South Africa. Then I realized we're sitting on a time bomb. So then the debate starts to ask, well, we need large-scale interventions. How do we do it responsibly? And I think that's where I agree with both Justin and Mercy. I don't think these are decisions that you should be making lightly. But that a decision needs to be made surgically is no longer negotiable. All right. We've got a similar situation playing out in the CBD. You know, the role of the VNA. Now, whether you like the VNA or not, it is the city's biggest electricity account, right? It is a fundamental element in the economy of Cape Town. Yet when we have a discussion about the transport, we try and play it down. The preciousness of whether we link underneath the bridge or to the water that is actually fenced off by a national key point. You know, we become very romantic in our debates, and we forget at the end of the day that there are masses and masses of people waiting for jobs. Okay, now am I altruistic? No, I speak on the development perspective. What attracts development? The reality is disruption attracts development. The status quo is there is not even a ripple on the ocean, right? Everything is status quo. How do I invest? How do I find new opportunity if they are not ripples? So we as an industry by default look for the stones that get dropped in the ponds and cause ripples and disruptions. It's not necessary or pretty, I get it. I agree with that. But we desperately need those ripples. And if we then drop into the R300 and we ask ourselves, we've heard some of the negatives, but what are the positives that the R300 could deliver? I think for me, I'm personally perhaps less obsessed about the northern extension, and I understand that that is probably the one that will run first. I'm obsessed about the southern extension, right? The question I've asked myself is, if the R300 from Mitchell's plan was to extend all the way through to Main Road South, right? What would happen in terms of people movement changes? Would we break down anonymity? We all complain about the apartheid city, but the apartheid city is sustained by the wishbone structure that we see in our transport network in Cape Town. What have we done to disrupt that? Have we created new linkages? Have we exposed the money in the Deep South to the opportunities in Philippi and Philippi East? I mean, Philippi East, I don't know when last you guys have been there. It is really, really an unfortunate environment at the moment. Desperate people without jobs. Right? And we've got to start thinking, how can we influence a job creation, break down the apartheid city structures, break down anonymity. And from that perspective, from a development perspective, then I get very excited because there are new opportunities. There are new receiving sides, there are new markets, there's a ripple. Impact on Bellville, and I think it's imperative to talk about Bellville. I'm extremely excited about the potential of Bellville. I'm personally extremely annoyed when people put up beautiful urban design pictures and they don't understand the economics of it. You know, and I personally challenged the mayor and I said, are you moving your head office to Bellville? Because if you are not going to vote with your feet and treat yourself as the catalytic investor into the Bellville area, how would the rest of the market do that? Now, what is the impact of the R300? You can either treat the R300 as something that is going to pull energy out of Bellville and dilute Bellville, or you can treat it as something that is going to bring energy to Bellville. So that's a choice we've got to make. And if it has the potential of bringing energy to Bellville, What needs to happen? Well, we need to make sure that the interchanges on the R300 are efficient. We need to make sure that the taxi industry is celebrated as the primary deliverer of people to and from that area. We've got to start thinking about bus networks. These routes should not be designed for the private car. They should be designed for the economy, right? Which means that public transport comes first. Vehicular movement with commercial vehicles, trucks moving product to and fro, that is the priority. It's not a private car design product. Unfortunately, because we don't intervene and we don't deal with these elements, by default it becomes a private car environment. So I don't think personally that we should be obsessed about whether this is a good or bad piece of infrastructure. I personally view the challenge to say, how can we maximize the value over all of these elements that we've identified, the desperate need for economic growth, the desperate need for job creation, the desperate need to break down anonymity. And if it can't tick those three boxes, then of course the project shouldn't happen. But if it does do that, even if there are some negatives with it, then we've got to look at mitigation. But I think the biggest challenge now is to say to ourselves, can we make a responsible decision within the next 6 months? Or are we going to do what Cape Town does so incredibly well, kick the ball down the road for another year, another 10 years, another 20 years? My view is we don't have the time. We have got to have a serious debate about surgical interventions in Cape Town. Otherwise, though I wanted to say the economy, not the economy, the inverse of the economy is going to make the decisions for us. And that is serious.
Thanks, Deon. Deon, that was really, really insightful. It didn't go the way I thought it would, which is fantastic. I do struggle sometimes to remain a little bit more neutral to a developer perspective, but I really feel like the points you raised there were not only valid, but I could really kind of onboard them as just a citizen of Cape Town going, yeah, like what is that thing what is our North Star from a development point of view, and what is that vision? So I really appreciate you kind of shaping it in that way. I think it's really going to help us moving into our question session. So in the limited reading that is available on the reasoning for the R300 extension, a lot of the work talks to reducing congestion and just the importance of the efficiency that a road network brings. And I think maybe at this point, going into a question, what I want to do is I want to just pull apart those two things. I want to pull apart investment as catalyst and the scale of the R300 extension and especially a north-south link that I think in our sort of spoken wheel sort of urbanist sort of mush that we have in Cape Town. I think that north-south link has always been a critical consideration. But what I want to pull apart is the efficiency of traveling, which the R300 really was kind of birthed as, versus the importance of that catalytic that combination of political vision, of well-spent investment, and the confidence that brings to particularly an area like Bellville where the promises are so real, but that first step is so important. So I think I want to open up sort of a bit of just a response, and I'm going to just jump over to Justin and say, Justin, if given the need to connect, given the need to build confidence and to catalyze that urban next that we keep talking about, but seems very talking and not as much happening. What would your vision be? What if the money was yours and Sanrail was in your was part of your Saturday afternoon braai, friends? What would you suggest as an alternative?
Yeah, no, thank you. And just so I'm a trained civil engineer. So generally I'm paid per ton of concrete. Ton of steel. So it does go against my nature to say, let's build less or, it goes against my profession. But just to some of Derek's points, the question of bottlenecks. The bottlenecks in the economy are the parastatal management of freight and ports. We have the 5 worst ports as rated by the World Bank, if you read the Sunday Times last Sunday, of which Cape Town, beloved Cape Town port, is one of the worst 5 in the globe. Djibouti and Mombasa outperform us on the African continent. So if I'm shipping, we don't talk about competitiveness, all right? If I'm shipping goods to Africa, I'm not coming to Durban or Cape Town. I'm going to Mombasa or Djibouti, because guess what? They're also closer to China. So they're closer to China and they're more accessible. So we talk about bottlenecks. Well, the bottlenecks and the hard choices. The bottlenecks are, I mean, not necessarily in our built infrastructure. They're in our logistics chains. They're in our how we manage logistics, who is responsible for freight and port management. There are harder decisions to make around delegation of authority and kind of national center, provincial center, and city center, which is where we ask ourselves where, will we be in 2050? Where will we be in 2050 with regards to who is managing these key infrastructures and key points. So to think of freeway link will solve port days and container days is misrepresentative, I think, or just is not connected. I think industrial policy, we talk about kind of like, I spend a lot of time in Mitchell's Plain working with the taxi industry, and I see people boarding to go to call center jobs in Woodstock, because that's where it's cool to be for the directors and the entrepreneurs and the investors that are pouring money into call centers from the UK, from Australia, from the US. In Woodstock was cool. Not Mitchell's Plain, but where is the economic policy, the industrial policy, the incentives, the tax breaks, the special economic zone? If we're serious about bringing economic opportunities, it's not freeways, infrastructure, even rail or bus or public transport. It's economic policy that would determine where factories are placed and where, and the apartheid era did this very well, badly, in terms of like homeland industries and kind of putting factories just across the border. So we do have a legacy with regards to using industrial policy to shape the landscape the way we want to.
So Justin, just to jump in there, so you're saying that congestion is real, but it's not a mobility issue.
And congestion
is that what you're saying?
So there's also a desired level of congestion. It's a making the car the king of the city is measuring how many cars we can get into the CBD, how many cars on the road. That's a 1995 measure. It's not a 2020 measure in terms of the number of cars. We need to measure number of people. And we do have infrastructure and a servitude, a beautiful servitude that requires 8 to 10 billion rands worth of investment. It's called Cape Town's rail network. We've got beautiful servitudes. We can create all the jobs that we need on the freeway, the freeway construction alternative, in rail upgrade. And the hard choice is more about who runs and controls and funds rail in the Western Cape than it is about where we should be building these linkages. So again, we have irreversible decisions. A 6-month time frame is just not something I can explain to my kids. When we are driving past the freeway, and freeways might connect the ends, but definitely they have a strong record globally of driving wedges between communities. You're either on, and even in Cape Town, you see you're on this side of the N1 or that side of the N1, this side of the M5, that side of the M5, and property prices are influenced and status is influenced by which side you are. So there are natural dividers because we are naturally human. So we talk about hard choices and hard actions, and absolutely, and definitely understanding where the city, the province, and the national agencies want to go is certainly important. And our track record with regards to building a private car product, the 2017, 2018 upgrade of the N1 doesn't have a bus lane, doesn't prioritize bus traffic, and doesn't support quality bus. So we just built a freeway 2 years ago. Go look at it. The car is king. And certainly, our generation of millennials and younger are not going to look at the car as king. We want the person to be the king of the city.
Thanks, Justin. Mercy, I want to just sort of change gears a little bit. And for me, even as an urbanist, I look at all of these issues, and they seem really sort of at an arm's length of something that even us as sort of development professionals could really impact outside of maybe annoying public officials or maybe writing a particularly well-crafted message to the mayor. But I say that in jest, but I think ways to really engage around issues are so important. And what I'm wondering is my question for you is within Bellville, Bellville could be an example of the city as it ought to be, not recovering, but sort of with a vision, you know, and I really want us to kind of come out of the sort of recovery mentality into being vision driven. And I feel Bellville has the parts available to kind of bring them together in a way that can be really forward looking. So my question to you is, how do you feel from a more of a ground up approach that there are ways to engage in how it is that land is used and how it is that catalytic projects are kind of conceptualized, if the R300 isn't in fact an if? Like, how do we ask for, as Bellville, as a city, as Bellville, as residents, how do we ask for that catalytic project? What are the mechanisms that you feel might be available that we could kind of tap into and work with to say, well, it's not the car, it's something else? Like, what do you feel that might be?
I think for me, it's always, and I think that's the point that I was trying to make, it's about engagement and bringing different voices together. And at the African Center for Cities, we have a long track record of trying to do just that through our City Lab processes, where we've brought together different people, NGOs, community-based organizations, officials, the public, the private sector, bring them together in a room on a monthly or whatever basis to talk about these kinds of issues, to talk about, so for example, as part of this VRC project, we had a bi-monthly City Lab seminar where we discussed issues like densification. And we had a transport engineer from the city come and talk to us about transit-oriented development and really engaging people around those kinds of issues. So I think those are the kinds of spaces that we have to create for people to have a voice, to have an input, and to kind of shape the vision of the city, and having these different perspectives. I think that's important, even before these kind of things are planned and signed off and implemented. Because otherwise, you know, I mean, there's so many white elephants of various kinds not being used, not having, I mean, if you just talk about Philippi, there was the Philippi, the cold storage market, you know, that was designed for 1,500 emergent farmers that never got used for that purpose. So, I mean, there are examples abound of these kind of processes or projects that never achieve their intended results because they are conceived of without taking into consideration people and the people that they are designed for. So, so I think, yeah, that's just my feeling.
I really appreciate that. And my question to Deon, but it might be rhetorical.
No,
take it as you need.
On to what Mercy just said, and I think, Kirsten, I think what she's emphasizing is the incredible disjoint between policy and, I don't want to call it reality, but let's call it the market. You know, what is this thing, the magical market? For me, the penny dropped one day when a senior official said to me, but why does the market, why do developers not want to build our policies? And I said to the person, but whose policies? Right, theoretical policies, hypothetical policies that more often change 3 yearly. I mean, let's just talk about the My City project, you know, and ask how often or what has actually happened. Is public-oriented transport development still the buzzword in the city? The answer is no. Personalities changed. It's no longer the buzzword. I asked the question, how many square meters did the city proactively rezone around the My City bus stations to support them? The answer is not a single square meter. So the policy network and the disjointedness of the policy network is probably, and the irrelevance, and I'm using a harsh word now, very often in the market reality, means that we remain worlds apart. And for me, Kirsten, the sad reality is it is still easier to develop greenfields in Cape Town than it is to develop brownfields.
Yeah.
And we're talking about the R300 as a project now, but I think it's the context, and that's what Justin was referring to, is we've got to contextualize this in the bigger context. And the bigger context is we don't know what we want, we don't have a vision, and therefore we don't have a policy network that can remain constant for at least 20 to 30 years. In our recent conference, I referred to Rwanda and Paul Kagame. Now, he might not be the most pleasant person, and, we can have a debate around that, but the reality is Rwanda's had one policy since 2000, right? And they've stuck to their guns, and their policy is very simple, and that is they will turn the average citizen from an earner of $230 to an earner of $960. But to achieve that, they need to do certain things. And I think we as urbanists are guilty for participating in jargonism versus actually saying, but what is our vision? What do we want for Cape Town? Because only once we've agreed on what Cape Town must be in 2050 can we actually apply Justin's test to say, well, is the R300 the right thing or the wrong thing?
So, Deon,
but we don't know what we want.
To interject, my question to you was going to be from Mercy's explanation of kind of engaging with people and hearing voices of how it is that folks want to see the city develop. My question to you is, could that be the ripple in the pond that you need rather than looking towards a sort of a master planning kind of environment of people sort of future casting as to what the city could be? For me, the ripple in the pond is already there. And I'm wondering if the combination of hearing voices and understanding how people would like to move becomes the catalyst for development. Like we are infrastructure, essentially, to catalyze rather than sort of millions and millions of rands of development that may or may not ease congestion, is my question, which you can take rhetorically or not, depending on.
I think it's a very important point. I don't think public participation, no, let me put it, I don't think communication is negotiable. What we've made public participation is a box ticking exercise. We abuse it in our environmental legislation, in our heritage legislation, our planning legislation, our policy creation. Policies advertised, it's put out there for 30 days, thanks, box tick, end of the story. So how do we design communication? But purpose shouldn't just be to have a nice chat. It should actually be outcomes based. We've got to, and I think we as people with tertiary qualifications are guilty for speaking on behalf of other people. So, I mean, that's your forte. How do we actually sit down with the youth on the Cape Flats and Khayelitsha? I'm fortunate. I happen to engage with some of the young black developers. It's a privilege to listen to the guys on how they actually go about doing things, how they understand their market, how they get yields of 20% plus on year one. And I can just sit and drool because we can't achieve that. So yeah, the art of sitting down and communicating, but I think we've got to get the youth in here to tell us what they want Cape Town to be like when they get to 50.
Agreed. I couldn't agree with you more, Deon. I feel like if you've come up with all our quotable tweets right there in your last sentence. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Hillary, who's kindly manning all of the machines in the background, has sent through a number of questions that have come out in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of try and pick some of the good ones without being too too cautious, just so we can keep things cooking. There's quite a lot of questions coming through around a lot of the nuance and some quite specific questions around obviously coming from people who live in the area. So I'm going to touch on one or two of those. If it's not something that we can answer, that's okay. But I really want to acknowledge the very real kind of day-to-day fears that people have of something so large being inserted into their nearby environment. So if you can't answer the question, that's fine. I do want to read some of them out just to acknowledge some of these very, very real issues and questions. Okay, so that was a really great segue to this question I have to scroll to now, which was, oh goodness, where is it now? Okay, so there are some questions coming through around the actual, Sanrail being the owner of, or at least the driver of most of this work, around the toll extension and how so this will affect poorer communities. So I think we have touched on that, but I do want to recognize that coming out of the questions. There's another question coming through. I don't have the name of the author of this. She says, it's well known that criminals target areas with easy access exit routes. Will the extension not open up a larger playing field for crime? And I certainly think that the way in which infrastructure is built and the way in which we move, stop, go has an impact on crime and opportunistic sort of crime. So I wanted to touch on that. So I'm not going to take an answer for that, but let's keep that in mind for a response. There's been a couple of questions around sound pollution, not only air pollution and impact on the ecology around the Kells River corridor in particular, but how will sound and air pollution mitigations plans be put into place? So that's another question to touch on. And then something quite practical, which I think comes back to, Justin, your question around placemaking and the importance of people being able to connect, which is there any detail, if this is from Sam, is there any detail available on exactly where the on and off ramps will be on Wellington Road, and have the properties in that area been taken into account? So I think some very real questions about looking at this map, saying like, is this, like, I'm now 50 meters away from a 6-lane highway. Like, how does that look in reality? And I think it's really important to touch on those kind of very real things. As you say, Deon, we can talk about this at a sort of a meta level of, like, how are we going to build the economy and reduce congestion, and how are we going to get to the Atlantis development zone? But in reality, somebody's going to be living 50 meters away from something that could fundamentally change their quality of life. So I just want to touch on that, maybe just have some reflections on how it is that, that sense-making process between people coming together, these catalytic infrastructure projects, and somebody's going to lose. So Justin, maybe if you can just sort of reflect on some of those questions of how do we bring people along in trying to elevate voices of people who are going to be fundamentally affected in very real ways.
Yes, I think, thank you. There's a really key lesson, and we don't need to go far to experience it, which is the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Program, which was touted as we're going to make things more efficient, to improve the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the gains of which have essentially been eroded over the last 10, 15 years, because there is this factor of triple convergence. So because you build a freeway, more people will use it. So unfortunately for us, there's no white elephants when it comes to freeways. They're oversubscribed. But the truth about freeways is you can't build your way out of trouble. You have 8 luxurious lanes in each direction going past Midrand, and at 4 p.m., if you walk, you're going to beat your compatriot home. So
Or cycle.
Exactly, yeah. I will get to that. So I think we've got real tangible examples of major program, huge impact, lots of macro promotion. But the reality is that we've loosened the belt and kept eating steak, and kept going. The fears that people fear, I think are real. Definitely, it's probably one of the most invasive programs that we could find in Cape Town, short of a second nuclear plant right next to the first one, which may or may not be working yet. We still don't know. And so I think when we look at the lesson I'm going to take out of GFIP is look at the vitriol, the anger, the frustration, and the political backlash that came from this very theoretical concept of what we'll do is we'll put a transponder in your car, you'll drive under this gantry, and it'll go beep, and we'll just take a little bit of money out of your pocket. Just a tiny bit. User pays. User pays, user pays, user pays, jargon, right? We all go to conferences and we say user pays. And when it's time for the user to pay, it was, I will take my hacksaw to the gantry. I will, the vitriol was very real. The pushback was very real, such that we're on the verge of this thing. I don't know if it has been officially gazetted as cancelled or not, but the point being is that the backlash was significant. And so I think there's a real risk and danger here that if we follow the 1995 thinking and we just implement, because we got budget, capital budget, we must spend it. we must do something. I take Deon's point. We must do more, a lot more. But I feel that there's such a lot of fear that we may do irreparable harm to the social fabric we're trying to promote. And then it becomes like those questions of them and us. And it becomes a question of, I want to get, in fact, let me move further up the R300 to an off-ramp into my gated community with my renewable energy and my Wi-Fi and my fiber, and I will only go out, and suddenly I'm totally withdrawn from the community in whole. What we have right now are vibrant communities that you can walk, in the streets, you can knock on doors, you can essentially, there's a real sense of place already. And so I feel that when we look at the fear and the angst amongst those that live along that corridor, you want to swap their green belt with a noisy highway, the political backlash and the social backlash, I think would be something that we definitely would want to think twice about.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the principle of change. And again, unfortunately, cities are, fortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, cities are complex things. And cities change. You take any of the great cities in the world, they go through changes on a regular basis. They are disruptive. If I was living in Paris when Haussmann decided to cut those corridors through Paris, I would be very cheesed off.
Yeah, but that was before the era of human rights.
But still, the principle is, but thank goodness somebody had a vision. And I think what we are saying is big interventions are, one, disruptive, and two, they have impact on people. And I think one should not tread bluntly on people. I think one should engage and one should debate and one should have those conversations. But at the end of the day, if you are going to intervene, if you are going to create a disruption, there will unfortunately be impacts. Now the question is, and our environmental legislation came up with a theory that you could mitigate, and look, and let's be brutally honest, there's certain things you can't mitigate against, right? If somebody builds a new airport, and the planes come in, well, the planes come in. Okay, so at what point is the bigger picture going to override? And at what point is the micro picture going to dictate? And I don't think we figured that out. When we talk about fine-grained urbanism, if we talk about environment like Woodstock and Salt River, just as an example, you must be out of your mind if you think you can demolish that fine grain and do something better. You can't. It's fantastic. Your point, Justin, we have not aligned our resources, our policies, and everything else to protect it. We do it theoretically, but in practice we don't. But when it comes to big interventions, we've got to ask ourselves, is this an intervention that will be the proverbial Haussmann intervention in Paris? Okay, I'm not suggesting that freeways is that, but I've got to pose the question. If I'm going to connect the Cape Flats to the southern deep south economy, right? Is that is it a Haussmann intervention? The answer is yes. So the question is, how can I do it responsibly? And I think that's where we're in agreement, right? Is that intervention is required is not debatable. How can you do it responsibly and sensitively? You talk about the Gautrain freeway network. I agree that the e-tolling was an absolute dismal mess. But did it lead to additional investment and job creation in the environment? Right? I mean, you need to just drive down that freeway to realize it made a structural change. You're right. You can't build yourself out of congestion. It's like water. You create capacity, it will come. But we've got to use these. These are tools that need to be used to plot within the bigger scheme. And the bigger scheme must be, what does Cape Town need to be competitive and sustainable by 2050?
And Deon, I'm going to jump in here with just one or two other questions from our audience that I think might assist us in steering us in that direction. And I'm going to ask Mercy to jump in on this question. And it really there really are a number of very interesting questions coming through from our audience around non-motorized transport. And it's not just coming from me as somebody who loves cycling, just you know, but just really, you know, surely the one of the best ways to bring together large scale kind of led investment in terms of mobility and connection, and bringing together a sensitivity around connecting people and actually engaging in ways of kind of actively bringing social cohesion to the table, surely must be not only rail, but cycling, active mobility, ways of connecting people where we can cover distances while being together, as a way to not only mitigate ecological damage in greenbelt areas, but also to be able to be this forward-looking society that we want to be, using infrastructure now to connect rather than to segregate. So I want to maybe just ask you on your opinion around the value of non-motorized transport infrastructure in this conversation around connecting.
You should answer that question.
No, I'm the neutral person there. I think that cycling is absolutely I mean, I know, right? but it does seem to me that when you can move a distance and still be able to make eye contact with somebody who doesn't look like you or sound like you, and you can share an experience, it just makes for a better world. But you know, if we take that sense of place but make it a corridor, like how do you feel that can kind of come into this conversation as something catalytic? Because I think what Deon's leaning towards is really impressing upon us is how important that catalytic moment is. You know, sort of incremental growth is not really doing the thing. So I wanted to maybe just ask you what your thoughts are around catalytic people-led infrastructure, essentially.
I think, you know, it's just coming back to just having conversations and creating spaces like the open streets. I mean, I went to the open streets Bellville it was amazing to see no cars on Voortrekker Road, to see different people from different backgrounds engaging, doing things together. And I think even I participated in an open streets talk about Maitland, and we walked to the other side of Maitland Village and on the Voortrekker Road. And it was just amazing to actually be able to walk. And we had some of our students from the architecture department participating in this exercise. So I think the more one can, have these kind of spaces and have these kind of opportunities where people from different walks of life can come together, talk about these things, get a vision for the city that's not driven by, the usual suspects, but actually the people who live and work in the city. I think that will go a long way. Also towards allaying fears. I think for me, when we started working, doing the research in Maitland, Kensington, and Factoryton, we spoke to a range of people in backyards, people in informal settlements, people living in flats, in formal housing. And we asked people a simple question about densification, because that's sort of the pillars of the city's VRC strategy. And people were like, what's densification? And then they were like, even people living in a place where there are 5 backyard shacks on a plot, already living in overcrowded, very unsafe conditions, people would say, no, I don't want to live in a 2-3 story walk-up. But, if you don't engage people around these issues, if you don't have these discussion forums or spaces where people can talk about their fears and have, questions and answers, then, you'll just always be fearful, and so I think also how we talk about these issues and the jargon that we use, the language, that we also need to take into consideration.
That's an excellent point. I always want us to do that, and I think part of the Bellville Conversations sessions is really about trying to sort of normalize, kind of break down assumptions that people have to try and make some of these terms and some of these ideas and some of this future planning a lot more accessible, I think, so that people can make the kind of decisions they need to do on a day-to-day basis around the way that the city is developing. So I have a question for you, Justin, on future casting this sort of transport corridor, and it was something that I was wondering was, if only a portion of this corridor, and I'm just going to call it a corridor for now. Let's say it might be vehicles, but maybe it's something else. Is it something that can be developed incrementally? I mean, is this northern extension, if it's just a portion to Wellington Road, for example, like, would that work? Does it need to be the entire ring road? Like, for me, my concern and my worry is that if it's planned as something entire and it's developed incrementally, then we don't have something entire and we don't have something incrementally considered. It just becomes sort of a bit of a mess in between. So my question to you is this corridor linking north to south with whatever mobility makes the most sense? Is that something that can develop incrementally? Or is it, as Deon might suggest, more of a kind of a larger scale catalytic intervention?
So we've already, what's been handed to us by previous generations is a car-oriented city. And the literature kind of points to this auto-dependent cycle where, because you've invested in automobile infrastructure like freeways, and I just want to say intervention shouldn't equal freeway or highway. I just want to make that point. So we've inherited this kind of auto-dependent world. And now every decision we make is just a little bit more, we're going to maintain it rather than maintaining 3 lanes of highway, let's keep 2 and make 1 a full dedicated bus lane. The N1 has more lanes than it needs. Congestion is good because it forces people out of their cars and into public transport. The framework is there. We've got our integrated public transport network plan. We have the National Land Transport Act, which delegates authorities. It's up to us to put pressure on public officials, on organizations, on your local representative, just like you should and would, to see the real change according to the strategy. So there is a roadmap that is called the Integrated Public Transport Network Plan of 2032, maybe 2042, maybe 2052, maybe 3042. The point being that there is a framework. There is large amounts of investment available at National Treasury and National Department for the improvement of public transport. And so I do think it's really important to take stock as we come out of this shock to everyone's system and the reality of really truly being on your own, that we do come up with a coherent vision. And it starts by saying we will not accept an auto-dependent city like the previous generations have. Any investment that we make should really reject the car as the main mode, because ultimately it might create some value, but rather than me spending my first paycheck on a house and buying an asset that will appreciate, I must spend my first paycheck on a car. And 5 years later, I realized, oh my goodness, there's this thing called depreciation, which I don't factor into my calculation. And so we are destroying value with regards to the mobility choices. We're destroying air quality. We're burning, dinosaur juice with regards to our choices. And so as we spread out, budget stretch, our energy balance stretches, and certainly, I totally agree with regards to dramatic interventions. But those interventions are beyond policy into implementation, are reform, are really looking at what are the true bottlenecks, our ports, our logistics chains, and what those strategies mean. And so certainly any incremental approach is going to have 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Your head on fire, your feet freezing, and no one's happy. And so certainly the danger of just doing a little bit here, a little bit there, and before you know it, you're just reinforcing an auto-dependent cycle where you have an opportunity to go a different direction.
I agree. I see that a lot in NMT, and it makes me a bit nervous. There are so many incredible questions. I wouldn't even know where to begin answering them, because they're the kinds of questions that I'm kind of getting here on my phone. They're the kinds of questions that I think political representatives and people who are making decisions about transport planning would really, really benefit from hearing, from listening and considering. So while I apologize for not being able to get through as many of these as I would like, they're just wonderful. We're going to be putting those on our discussion forum on the Bellville Connect page, and hopefully being able to kind of collate those in a way that starts those voices and those questions that we have as residents and people who work and live in Bellville to start moving in the right direction. So I really want to thank you so much to everyone who's listening for this excellent feedback. We have received 1 or 2 questions around sort of parallels between the rollout of the MyCity bus service, the way in which that did or did not or could not catalyze development. And I think maybe that's a question for another day, but I did want to highlight that idea of people raising the question of catalytic investment in mobility that's not necessarily an impenetrable corridor, also not moving the needle. So I think that's some comments we've got through on that. And a couple of folks also mentioning in particular how important it is for us to grow NMT investment. That's also come out quite a lot. What I want to do is maybe just is move towards a wrap up, because we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. We've managed to chat about so many aspects and not really come to a decision on whether the extension is a good or bad thing, which for me is quite a success in terms of our debate, because it's not for us to say, it's for us to be able to help people to position themselves in this ongoing debate and start engaging and knowing how to do that. So I'm very, very happy. I'm sure everyone in our audience has probably found a champion on the panel. Like, I'm with Deon, no, Mercy's got it right. So that's great. But what we're going to do is we're going to go into a bit of a wrap up now. And I'm going to ask each of you to maybe just share sort of a wrap up of sort of 3 or 4 sentences in terms of where it is that we should take this conversation next. As people, within the sort of urbanist industries and professions, knowing that the fear is real, the worry is real, uncertainty, the lack of vision is real. Like, where should this discussion go next in order for that future vision that is the next thing? So it's not a when, it's if. What is that thing? What is the best next step in terms of your perspective coming into this discussion saying, well, we're not sure, but here's a practical next thing. So maybe, Deon, I want to start with you. I'm going to go this way, and then Justin, you can close us out.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of points that were raised which really resonate with me. And again, the challenge that we're sitting with in South African cities, let me be controversial. I'm starting to believe that we've got a constitutional crisis. And that is, we say to each other that cities are the growth of a country. It's true in most countries, yet in South Africa, we refuse to take the handbrake off cities. We want to control it by national. You look at some of the edicts coming out of Treasury, dictating to local authorities, and of course we understand the reasons and the problems, the role of province, the role of SANRAL in a metropolitan environment, the role of PRASA. And we say magically all of these entities must come together and they must share a common idea. It is impossible. So what have we learned in the rest of the world? We've actually learned that the buck stops with the city, right? I was fascinated when New York tendered the ports contract, and to look at who in the world bid to service the New York ports. But it was the city of New York that issued that tender. Now, I think our crisis at the moment is that at the moment nobody is in charge, right? Constitutionally, local authorities are given the task of looking after economic development, but they're not getting the tools. Provincial government gets provincial transport, health, and education. In the rest of the world, a city runs its education system. And I think this is maybe part of our challenge in South Africa, and this is why we just cannot get going, is because there are too many statutory role players that get to influence the debate, yet they don't get to influence the vision. So how do we take this debate forward? I mean, that it is a big project or a potential project, I don't think anybody can debate. That it's taking place in a void is, I think, the consensus today. Or in whatever form, Justin. And how do we take it forward? I think we've got to start to say to each other that for too long, the people of the city haven't been part of the debate. And the debate cannot be funneled through the traditional methods. And I think, Mercy, this is where people like you come in incredibly important, is to say, well, what is the conversation and how do we take the conversation to the streets?
Yeah, that's such a great segue to your wrap-up, Mercy. What do you feel as a wrap-up?
Yeah, I just want to agree with Deon. I mean, it's when I was trying to prepare for this discussion today, I just felt so ill-equipped because there was just no information available. And I think, like, how can you expect people to engage if there is no information? And I really don't understand, maybe my fellow panelists know, but I don't understand why there's so much secrecy or around this project. So for me, that's the first thing. I mean, we need information. We need this information to be in the public domain for people to be able to engage around it, to make this, to make decisions, informed decisions about it, and then to create the kind of spaces for engagement that I already spoke about and mentioned so much. But I think also at the end of the day, we live in a city, in a country that, yeah, there's huge inequality. We are the most unequal country in the world, and even a city like Cape Town. And how do we go about creating a more equitable society, looking at issues of transport equity, providing for everyone and providing choice? I think that's the problem. There's so little choice for poor people in the city, whether it comes to the type of housing that they live in, whether it comes to the kind of transport that they have access to. So I think that those are the kind of discussions that we have to have. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mutually agree with everything that you've just said. Justin, you have 2 minutes to wrap up for us, and we started with a very wonderfully technocratic flag in the ground that you planted for us, and I'd love for you to close out with where you think this could go next.
I think this is probably one of the most important projects in Cape Town for a very important reason. One, it's no one knows who owns it. Is it a central project, a province project, a city project? There's no ownership. So I think Deon's point is right on. There needs to be this unified vision, direction, and agency. London is the way it is because 29 boroughs come together and made transport for London, a unified vision. I don't want the middle class to quit Cape Town. And when I say quit Cape Town, I mean still live in Cape Town, still enjoy the beach and the amenities and the economy, but quit the society and quit the challenges that we have as a society by going to kind of hide behind a gated community off a freeway. I also think that there is enormous opportunity coming. COVID has reset the button. You can expect a ton of Gautengers to move down to work remote because now they can. They don't have to live up in the big smoke. You can expect international people to come and live in Cape Town and enjoy. So in terms of our market, we can expect our market to be buoyant and grow for quite some time. It's a dividend that we don't want to waste. Our public transport network is an important strategic tool. And just if you look at this corridor, I mean, my vision, when I look at this beautiful green belt, is let's connect this entire corridor with bikes. Let's be the Netherlands of the northern suburbs. Let's take this corridor, let's build this beautiful greenway, protect it, grow it, and let's connect. I want to be able to have breakfast in Bellville, lunch in Tyger Valley, and supper in Bloemendal.
Cycle as much as Kirsten does.
And so, and if you think about this, right? As we come out of COVID, wellness and health is going to be a global trend. People have been locked in their houses globally for 2 years now. They're worried about their health. They want to see the world. In this corridor, leading to this corridor, we have probably one of the world's best mountain biking tracks that link all of these farms. This is a strategic tourism asset. What you don't want is this huge freeway ruining such an important inbound investment. You know, we want to bring our corridor. We also, if you think about the university that we built in Durbanville, in the corner of Wellington, we started at Wellington, we'll end at Wellington. UC Davis in California has 30% bike share. It's a university town. So if we're going to have the next university town being at the edge here, let's make it a bike-led university town. So the R300 extension should have 2 wheels only.
Thanks, Justin. I really appreciate you speaking on behalf of bike lovers everywhere without me having to do it on your behalf. Okay, so we are out of time, and I think we're going to be absolutely 100% finishing on time today. Let me double check. Yep. So I really want to say a huge thanks to our panelists. What an incredible group of minds and hearts we've managed to host today here. And it really has been a privilege. Thank you so much for coming out of your homes and from behind your screens to be with us today. This conversation is just beginning, and I really want to thank everyone who's joined us today for the views you've expressed, the anger you've expressed, the questions that you have that are valid. When is it happening? How does it affect my home? Can I still drive my kids to school because they live on the other side? These are all very valid questions. And for me, and my perspective, I absolutely feel like the door is still open for us to express these and work together to build the community that we want to build and move the way that we feel we should be moving in 50 years' time. So I really appreciate your time and your effort and that you've spent it with us this afternoon here in Bellville Conversations. Please can I ask you to head over to bellvilleconnect.co.za. There is a R300 discussion forum where a lot of these conversations will keep going, and we certainly will point political and decision-making representatives in that direction so that they too can hear your voice and understand the fears and aspirations you have for this mobility corridor. So I'm going to wrap up there. I'm going to say thank you so much to Warren digitally. Thanks, Warren. I know you're sort of with us in spirit today. And thank you to the Greater Tygerberg Partnership for catalyzing this incredible start to a conversation of how it is that Bellville will be developing in the future. So that's it for us. That's a wrap. Thank you so much, panelists. And I'm sure we'll see you shortly again. So that's us.